name is Clip. Welcome to Candid Conversation Zoomed In on our channel, Candid Conversation Zoomed In and Comments Videos channel. This morning, I'm speaking with William Hazelgrove. He's an author, very well-known author to be exact, and he's come out with a new book, which I found very fascinating. It's called Dead Air, and it talks about the night Orson Welles did the H.G. Wells play War of the Worlds, and basically, essentially, if I could put it this way, scared the crap out of America. William, thanks for taking the time to talk today about this book. I was very fascinated by it, and I first wanted to know what got you interested in doing this particular story.
I had known about Orson Welles for a while, read several biographies. Like a lot of people, I'd heard about War of the Worlds. I didn't know a lot about it. In 2015, a book came out that said basically this wasn't a big deal. A lot of people didn't really believe it. It was confined mostly to the East Coast. It was overblown by the newspapers trying to take revenge on radio. When I started to think about this story, and it didn't really sit well with me, so I started to do some research. And what I did was I used all newspapers. I went back to all the small papers, the big papers, and what I found was this was really a event that went coast to coast, terror, sort of a terror wave, if you will, that went across the country. And in fact, people did believe, large amounts of people believed that Martians had attacked, had landed, were incinerating people with heat ray guns and poison gas. And this invoked mass panic, and so that from there, in my business, basically, you write a proposal to a publisher. So, again, there's really is this an event a lot of people know about, but it hasn't been covered a lot in terms of books. There's been a few, but nobody's really taken a hard look at it. And so my thesis was simple. It's like this was a major event in the United States. People did believe that Martians had landed, and it changed radio forever.
In what way did it change radio forever? How did it spark the change, or what did it do? Did it cause more regulation, or did it? How did
You know,
that
uh,
happen?
yeah, we hear a lot about fake news now, and radio at this time, all right, this is golden age of radio, so everybody has a radio. Also, the AM Amplitude Act had been passed, which basically said every car had to have a radio. So for the first time, people are tooling around in 1938 with a radio in their car, listening to the radio. This was very, very known. This also will add to the fact that, War of the Worlds will become this ubiquitous event from coast to coast. Also, radio was at this time had produced news. There was a show called March of Time, and March of Time was their 60 minutes. And basically, what they did was they didn't report real news, they reported produced news. And take, for example, the Hindenburg. When the Hindenburg crashed, there was actually a WLS Chicago reporter there who was on the scene. And he recorded what happened in real time, and he had to go off the air because he was so overcome. Well, when he went back with that recording, nobody really wanted to play it. Why? Because produced news. So what March of Time did was they took their version of the Hindenburg, reproduced it with sound effects and actors and sound men in the studio. And so that was the standard way news was produced. Well, after Orson Welles, War of the Worlds, which again, we can talk about this, but this was produced absolutely, produced news and radio in general was basically a symphony. You had an orchestra, you had people around microphones, you had sound men, and then you had Orson Welles up on a podium conducting all this. It was all orchestrated, it was all live, of course. So after all the carnage of War of the Worlds, the FCC said no more produced news. Radio forever.
Okay, so basically, produced news goes out the door after this because of the shock of the Orson Welles show. And by the way, I remember that the story of the Hindenburg. I forget the reporter's name, but that was amazing, that event. And he was there and he saw it blow up. And I'm surprised nobody really went after that story and took it as you say, as broadly as they did. It ended up having to be, as you put it, in produced news. So Orson created this particular event, if you will, but at the same time was taking it from the H.G. Wells book, which basically was
Right.
a large book, if I'm not mistaken, almost a series of books, if you will, narrowed it down into this radio play, produced it. And at one point, I'm reading in your brief on this, apparently raised his hands for 6 seconds, and that's when essentially all heck broke loose. What
Right.
what really happened during those 6 seconds? What happened after that?
Okay, so if you take War of the Worlds, you have to first thing you have to understand is it's a broadcast on a broadcast. It begins with music at a New York hotel. So this was standard operating procedure. People would have these live broadcasts of these, this sort of dinner music. So you open with that. Then what Orson Welles did when he took H.G. Wells' novel and said, I want to set this, as a radio play. It was his 17th radio play for Mercury on the Air. He hired a guy named Howard Koch. And Koch's job was to convert this. And Koch was like, this is ridiculous. Nobody will believe this. This is impossible to do. And Wells said, no, I want you to do it, but also I want you to do it as a breaking news format. Okay, so what's going on? Well, a couple of things. One is Hitler just threatened to invade the Sudetenland and bring back, the Sudetenland Germans into the Reich. And basically, Britain and France said no, and then Hitler said, I'm going to do it anyway, and this would touch off World War II. So America was getting bombed for the first few weeks of October with these breaking news bulletins, where basically, CBS would interrupt the program, go, we bring you a breaking news bulletin. So people were very, very on edge. So Orson wanted to take this and apply it to this broadcast, which also, historically a lot of people said, oh, he didn't mean to do it. And Orson Welles absolutely meant to do this. He absolutely meant to scare everybody. So he tells Koch, do this too. Koch cannot get going. He finally goes to Grover's Mill, New Jersey after driving out to see his parents, and he stops at a gas station. He gets a map. He looks around. He says, okay, this is where I'll start the invasion. The Martians will land here. So from there, he could write the whole script. So what Wells also did was he wrote into it that this reporter, Carl Reddick, would be incinerated on the air by the Martians. So making radio actually part of the program, kind of breaking the third wall. So my book's called Dead Air, The Night Orson Welles Terrified America. The reason it's called Dead Air is because after the reporter is incinerated, Orson holds up his hands in the NBC, in the CBS studio in Manhattan for total silence. Now, dead air in broadcasting is death. This is how shows get canceled, people get thrown off the air. You always want to have fill. Well, Orson holds up his hands for 6 seconds of dead air. And in this dead air is this terrifying moment as listeners are listening. They believe that the Martian has just incinerated this reporter and the world is basically stopping. And so for 6 seconds, people their minds run wild. They come back, they go, due to, technical difficulties, we can't continue with our broadcast. But this was brilliant on Wells' part because this was more terrifying than anything at all. And then he continues on to the broadcast. Another thing to know is that War of the Worlds was only terrifying in the first 30 minutes. There's a station break at the 38-minute mark. After that, it's very sleepy. It's Orson Welles walking around talking about what happened. But Orson knew that all the fireworks from the first half. So what happens? The CBS executive Taylor Davidson sees the switchboard lighting up with calls, all these people freaking out. He tries to break into the studio. His Wells partner, John Houseman, he stops the executive, Taylor Davidson, from coming into the studio. He holds the door shut so Wells can continue. So this also shows that Wells knew exactly what he was doing. Then the police show up. And they too want to go into the studio because they're getting all these calls at the police station. People are showing up with all their belongings saying, where can I go to get away from the Martians? And so they go to CBS and are like, what's going on? And John Houseman holds the door closed against them. And Wells can see all this through the glass as he's going through. He actually flubs a few lines because he's so stressed. But his whole thing is to get to that mid mark of the station break, because after that, all the fireworks are over. And by the way, everybody's already taken off for the hills. Everybody's freaking out and running. Now, something else happened too during this time. Charlie McCarthy. It was the Edgar Bergen Charlie McCarthy show. Now, Orson Welles only had 1 million people at best as listeners out of 33 million people listening on the radio. Charlie McCarthy, the dummy, the ventriloquist, had 10 million. Okay, so when they went to break and went to Nelson Eddy singing, all those listeners started twisting the dial and ended up on War of the Worlds. So Wells's program got supercharged up to 11 million viewers, and they came in the middle of it, so they assumed this was real news. And during Wells's program, he cuts to the army. The army gets incinerated. And he cuts to bombers. The pilots get incinerated. And by the way, time is collapsed in Welles' program. I mean, logically, you'd say, this couldn't all happen within 20 minutes. But logic was out the window, because Welles would play little tricks during the broadcast, saying, "Oh, we've just talked to the reporter for 20 minutes," or he put all these little fibs in there all over the place to make people think that time had been stretched, and going back and forth to the music and then cutting away with breaking news bulletins. This disoriented people. So people believed that, in fact, the army had been incinerated, that the Martians were marching toward Manhattan, and that the Air Force had been called in and they'd been incinerated. Logically, you say, how could anybody believe all this? But they did.
That's amazing that actually people got fooled like that. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Orson Welles, a couple of days after, just sort of chuckled this away, like, yeah, okay, I scared a few people. And that's
Well,
what's,
yeah.
you kind of chuckle this away. What did he actually get in real trouble for this at all?
Yeah. So what happened was, after the broadcast, he, the CBS locked him, he and John Houseman, in an office, and they decide what to do with him. They didn't know if they're getting death threats. They didn't know if they're going to get sued. They didn't know if they're going to get arrested. So Welles, quickly, this had spun out of control, and everybody thought, well, his career's over. And when he hit Times Square, he saw this big scroll: Orson Welles terrifies the nation. So Welles actually left. He went back to Woodstock, Illinois, which was where he went to school, the Todd School. A guy named Skipper Hill ran it, and he was almost like a surrogate parent to Welles, who lost his parents when he was 16. And he was severely depressed. He thought, this is it, I'm all done. And people were threatening to sue CBS. The FCC was talking about censorship. Orson Welles was just getting these death threats, all these letters to the editor. And then Dorothy Parker, who was this very, very popular columnist, one of the most highly read columnists at the time, she wrote an editorial. And she said, basically, Orson Welles did everybody a favor by showing how stupid and ignorant and uneducated the American public is to believe something like this. And he showed how Adolf Hitler could use radio to just overtake America, because people will believe anything. And he said that, Orson Welles deserved a medal because only stupid people would believe this. She said it was ridiculous. All this happened within 25 minutes. Martians, it just showed that, people in America are really wholly uneducated and not sophisticated enough to differentiate fact from fiction. Well, this one article turned everything around. Welles came back. He got a sponsor. Campbell Soup came in and sponsored his show. His show, by the way, was unsponsored. It was called Sustaining Programming, which basically meant it was for the good of the country. So, it was a very, very small program. Well, after he got a sponsor, he got big stars. Campbell Soup promoted it. But then, of course, the cherry on top of all this was Hollywood said, we want you to come to Hollywood and make 2 movies. Here's $500,000, RKO. And of course, Orson Welles never made a movie in his life. But they said, make whatever you want. And so Orson Welles did. He went to Hollywood and made Citizen Kane. So in a way, he walked up to the cliff. And this is pure Orson Welles. Orson Welles' whole approach to art, be it in theater, radio, or movies, is to tear everything apart and then put it back together in a different way. And that's really what he did. But, in this instance, he came out smelling like a rose.
That's interesting that he did come out smelling like a rose, especially after what happened. Now, how did you, in this book, you're basically are dispelling myths. How did you come up with the information basically to say this is what really happened? What you said you went through newspapers. Um, how did you basically confirm that, verifying it so that you could put that in the book to make sure that you're back checking that story? How did you do that?
Well, newspapers are really great because they were unedited back then. Pretty much they went right to press. So what I would do is I would get an article, a story, say like, there's a story about a bus in North Carolina where a man ran onto the bus and said, "The world is ending, Martians are killing everybody." And then the driver took off with all the passengers and took him on this wild ride because he was so freaked out. And then that ended up in several newspapers. So you can start to see, if you start to cross-reference, you're like, okay, this is true because you have several different accounts. Also accounts of people running out of restaurants, not paying their checks. People running into theaters during movies screaming, "The world's ending, Martians are landing and killing everybody." And then these theaters, people would just run for the hills. One woman, she just had a baby, and all the nurses disappeared. And they were all in the hall crying. And, they told her the world's ending. And she thought, "Oh, no, and I just had this baby." Another woman during her wedding, everybody found out and freaked out and left her reception. And so she told the band to play the Charleston. She danced the whole Charleston the whole time. She figured, well, this is it. I'm going to dance the Charleston. Another gentleman who had multiple affairs ended up telling his wife of all his affairs because he figured, well, this is the end of the world. And then he found out it was a broadcast. Another man, he had asked this woman to marry him 20 times, and she said no. And he goes, "Look, it's the end of the world. You might as well, say yes." So she does. And then they find out it's a broadcast. I mean, so, another gentleman, his daughter was at a college. She calls him up crying to come get her. He takes his Studebaker, takes off, drives 100 miles, gets there, sees all these other girls who were crying and begging to go with him. He takes the doors off his car, loads it with all these girls, straps some of them across the hood, some of them across the trunk, drives 100 miles back to his hometown. I mean, so, again, this is coast to coast. There was a studio executive in the Redwood Forest who's with his wife. They hear on the radio about, the Martians are coming and they're incinerating everybody, and they want to get back home to their children, but they run out of gas. And so he wrote later, he said, all we can do is sit there and wait for the Martians to appear over the trees. So, this was a coast to coast event. So what does this mean? It's a meant it was covered by the newspapers. And these little gumshoe reporters would go out in all these small towns and interview people, like in Concrete, Washington, where the power failed during the broadcast. Everybody ran for the hills. And by the way, people wouldn't come back. They told them, this was all broadcast. And a lot of people refused to come back to their homes. Another gentleman heard the broadcast. He and his wife jump in their car, take their dog, throw it in there. He flies out of his garage without putting the door up, and goes through it. And then he turns to his wife and says, "Well, at least we don't have to fix that." So again, these are little stories that I found just by combing through all these newspapers. And this is what most people have missed about the War of the Worlds. CBS had 126 affiliates. So it wasn't just New York. This beamed all across the country. So all across the country, this was happening. Also, people, when driving the car, start driving crazily all over the place, going through red lights. The police would catch up with them, and they'd keep driving. One gentleman who picked up his girlfriend from college drove, as fast as he could. These cars went about 70 at the time. Took a turn, the car flipped over 4 times, and he wrote later, he said, "Well, I figured if I died in a car wreck, that was better than dying by the Martians." Another gentleman came home, and his wife was sitting at the kitchen table with a bottle of cyanide. He said, "What are you doing?" She said, "I'd rather go this way than by the Martians." So again, these stories, you just would find them in all these newspapers, and that gives you the verisimilitude, the closest thing to truth you can find.
Yeah, I bet that really must have been interesting to go through. So, how did you piece the book together? What's the structure of the book itself? Do you do like?
Basically, to understand where the world's, you have to understand Orson Welles. So what I do is I have the front story of basically how War of the Worlds is coming together. Wells is only 23 and how it's produced and everything's happening. The backstory is Orson's story. How he, 2 years old, was proclaimed a genius when he said to a Dr. Bernstein, doctor, the only thing that separates man from beast is the fact that man can have medicine to treat himself. And so then they're like, oh, he's a genius. And so from then on, Orson Welles, his whole life would be proclaimed a genius. At 16, his parents die. Dr. Bernstein becomes his guardian. He goes to Ireland, barnstorms the theater. He has no idea what he's doing, but he had this voice, this incredible voice that people just couldn't believe. And so they cast him, and he actually did well in Irish theater at 16. He goes to New York, has to start over, but guess what? The golden age of radio is there. And he has his voice. So he starts getting all these radio shows, and then he gets The Shadow, only the shadow knows. And this was a big breakthrough for him. Also, Orson gets a ambulance because he literally has to get to each radio show across Manhattan. And so he uses an ambulance to get through traffic, get to the radio show. They would hold the elevator for him, go into the studio, they go live, he'd take off again to the next thing. Also, he was doing plays. So he's doing Voodoo Macbeth, which was Macbeth in Harlem. He used all black actors, Fascist Caesar, where he basically based it on Hitler. And these were groundbreaking plays, and they were hits. So this guy was just sort of lighting up everything. So in the structure of the book, I go from this developing Orson Welles to the War of the Worlds, and as that evolves. And so I mean, Orson Welles was the kind of guy who would have you look through his telescope, ask you if you see stars. You say, no, I didn't. And then he'd thump you on the back of the head and say, now do you see stars? I mean, he was that kind of guy. And so, I sort of use these two tracks that come together in the latter part of the book when actually the broadcast begins.
Hmm. Okay. So, now you were saying that there was all kinds of mayhem. Did anybody uh, die in this in
Yeah,
the
good
aftermath
question.
of?
So Orson Welles is on a Bond tour at a couple of years after the broadcast, and he walks into the lobby of a Kansas hotel, and with another gentleman, and suddenly this man attacks him and starts beating him savagely, and screams at him, "I swore if I ever saw you, I would kill you." Well, they do some investigation, and they find out this man's wife committed suicide on the night of the broadcast. So people did die. People had heart attacks. There was one gentleman who, hospitals had people being admitted for heart attacks and shock. And also one gentleman who just had surgery, jumped out of his bed, tore out all the tubes, jumped in his car, bleeding all over the place, and drove home. I mean, so, there was real carnage from this broadcast. And a lot of this was pushed down because CBS and Orson Welles had no interest in letting people know the darker side, if you will. And the letters to Orson Welles are really heinous. I mean, there's people who just swore if they ever saw him, they shoot him, because a lot of people, their families freaked out. And again, people ran out of apartment buildings with blankets over their heads because they thought it would stop the poison gas. And poison gas, by the way, was a very heinous type of weapon that had been used in World War One, and chlorine gas, mustard gas. So people, really viewed poison gas as the worst kind of way to die. And so, yeah, he did create real carnage. A famous photo of a woman with a sling, with her arm in a sling, went all around the country and ended up on front pages. And she was an actress who had fallen down the stairs after running out of her apartment building in New York. And they took a picture of it and said, "Casualty of War" was the caption under it. So, yeah, people died, people had heart attacks, people contemplated suicide, and some did commit suicide.
Now, of course, through the years, as you have seen, I'm sure there's been a revision of this. Like you said, it's been pushed down. Why do you think that is? Is that because of all this stuff that happened, or people just want to forget? Why do you think that has happened?
I think that's part of the revisionism of the last few years of history, where people have a hard time viewing events outside the context of 2024. We're living in a time where a lot of mythology is being torn down, statues are being torn down. And I think War of the Worlds fell victim to this too. I think we feel like in the computer age, we know best. And how could these people really believe that Martians had landed? And so, when a book comes out, like the one that came out in 2015, they say, well, this really wasn't a big deal. That book was built from letters the FCC received. I think it goes along with the fact that we know best. We can interpret history now. You were bad, you were good. And, you can't moralize in history. That's the first thing. And the second thing is you have to realize that in 1938, radio was brand new. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, had just started going on during the 30s for his fireside chats during the Great Depression. This was very new. This was incredible that the president was talking to you in your living room. So radio had great veracity. The thought was, well, nobody would ever lie on radio because the president's on radio. So when Orson Welles did this, there was no thought that anything like fake news or a hoax could ever be at play. And Orson Welles later, two events here. One is at the very end of his show, he told everybody, hey, this was just a big hoax I played on Halloween because this happened on October 30th, 1938. Later, maybe 10, 15 years later, there's an interview by, I think it was the BBC, where Wells admits it. He says, people still come up to me and tell me that they really believe Martians had landed. And he said, we did this because we felt like radio was something that had really taken people over in a way, and that people shouldn't believe everything that comes out of the radio. Really, though, the reason Orson Welles did it is because Orson Welles was an artist who took everything to the limit. And it was a natural progression to create a great impact, as he did with, Voodoo Macbeth in Harlem, Fascist Caesar. Well, now he's going to take radio and he's going to break the third wall of radio and make radio part of the drama. And he's going to push it all. And it's just that sort of brilliance where you say, okay, I'm going to take this medium and twist it and see what it can do. And that's really why he did it. Because, Wells did not do well in Hollywood after War of the Worlds. He went there and made Citizen Kane, which today is regarded as the greatest movie ever. But it did terribly at the box office. It lost 150,000 for RKO. The Magnificent Ambersons were never completed, his second movie. So the studio finished it, and that was horrible and lost money. Wells then went on down to South America to make a movie, never making it, coming back after spending $100,000. So his name was pretty much mud in Hollywood after that. And one reason was because Wells had a hard time beyond art for art's sake. He was not a great storyteller in the way movies had to be produced and put together. He would go make Touch of Evil and these other movies, but that wasn't his movies. These were other people's movies who he was either director or he would star in or something like that. But he could never get his own movies financed after the sort of debacle of Citizen Kane and Magnificent Ambersons because, he lost a lot of money for people. So in a way, you could look at War of the Worlds as his most successful endeavor. And whenever you talk about Orson Welles, most people will not say Citizen Kane. They'll say, oh, War of the Worlds. So that's really what stuck.
It sure did stick with him. We're talking about it today. Well, what's the purpose of the book? What do you want to get across to the audience at hand reading this book? What do you want to tell them?
Well, I want them to understand this is a pivotal moment in broadcasting and news, and also that, this great hoax really showed that people believed anything that came through media. And if anything, we live in a time today where we're having to always question what comes through media. Everybody is like, oh, fake news, fake news, fake news. Well, this is as old as the hills. Orson Welles gave us our first fake news, if you will. And so, you have to have a critical intelligence. You have to question things and go, okay, is that really going to happen? Also, I just want people to go for the ride because, well, in all my books, it's really the journey, not the destination. And by the end of it, you're like, wow, that was amazing. That's an amazing. Also, too, this is the only instance we have of how people would react if Martians really did land, an alien really did come to Earth. Um, would they all freak out? Probably. Okay, I mean, in fact, the government has this in their UFO Blue Book, this incident. They studied War of the Worlds as an example of how civilian populations might react to an alien landing. In H.G. Wells' novel is a very simple plot, really. These cylinders come down, the cylinder opens, the Martian pops out. He looks like a big spider. He has a ray gun in one hand, poison gas in the other one, and they take off for New York. And in Wells, it's in Britain, so everything's changed. But I mean, that's basically it. And so they go around and they need the blood from humans to sustain themselves and all this stuff. So, this very, very simple, sort of fantastic plot actually translated to 1938, and with this new medium where people were on edge because they thought war was going to break out any minute. Also, there'd been a huge hurricane a few weeks before, and again, these breaking news formats, people were very edgy from those. And as Wells used it, like I said before, it's a broadcast and a broadcast. He'd break from the dinner music to his on-the-spot reporter, go back to the Army, go back to the Air Force, until finally the final scene, in the first half is the reporter in New York gets incinerated. And then the final scene is there's nobody left, just this shortwave radio voice saying, is anybody there? So it's a very eerie broadcast. You listen to it today, and again, you can think, how could anybody believe this? But they did.
Yeah, that's the thing. They sure did. Do you, from your perspective, studying Orson Welles, do you think he really was the genius that everybody claimed he was?
I think he was. I mean, I think, he laughed about that later and said, I'm either a genius or a huckster. I think when what he would do is in take War of the Worlds, all that week before the broadcast, he would tear the script apart and then put it back together. He did this right up to the moment they went on the air, and he would just infuse it with all these little, Orson Wellesian type of things, these little aspects of the broadcast, these nuances that made it something very different. A lot of people work with him said it was a sleight of hand. Everything had to come together in a sort of crazy way. And literally, he was changing dialogue minutes before he'd go on the air. And this created incredible tension and also made the actors better. So in that way, yes, he had the genius of the artist. How does that translate to making money in this world? Not very well. Not very well. It's, you can't have it both ways. And so when Wells hit Hollywood and he lampooned William Randolph Hearst and Citizen Kane, Hearst came down on him and, pushed down on the movie, pushed down on the theaters, pushed down on media, and really hurt Wells and pretty much blackballed him from then on. So, in a way, he went too far in Hollywood, but that's Orson Welles. He said later, in an interview close to the end of his life, he died at 70 with a typewriter in his stomach. He said, my type of art is something that has to be done my way or it won't work. It's just, I can't make it fit into anything else. It has to be done my way. Well, that's a very hard thing to have somebody like Hollywood sponsor because it requires a lot of faith that, you'll somehow pull this thing off. Probably the closest comparison would be Francis Ford Coppola making Apocalypse Now, which was just a mess right up until, he finally got the final product. And that was the way Wells worked. Wells worked under incredible pressure. He would inhale enormous amounts of food, alcohol, tobacco. He always had a cigar. He would go with no sleep. He'd take Benzedrine. It was all just chaos, 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 chaos. And then, boom, you had some art. It's that thing of, the most diseased oyster produces the best pearl. So that was Orson Welles.
It sounds like he was quite a character, that's for sure.
It was.
I have to say that I'm a former broadcaster myself. I actually remember learning about the play when I was in learning about broadcasting. And you're right about dead air. Dead air is not an art form. We used to joke about it in college radio here in Hamilton. Oh yeah, yeah, dead air. It's an art form. Well, not really. It costs money, and you have to do make goods and stuff like that. Not a thing you want, and you can get kicked off the air. And also, regulators can come and fine you for it too. So it's really, really important not to have it. So what Wells certainly did create a moment of total sheer panic, but also showed how you could use that space to basically do that and draw attention. And he did it very successfully because, like I said, we're talking about it today. Really appreciate this. What other things are you doing in your book world? Because I know you have a few other things out there. What other interesting things do you want people to take a look at with regard to your catalog? Because I know you have a lot of books. Are there any
Yeah,
other gems that you want to promote here while we're at it?
sure. Yeah, well, you can go to williamhazelgrove.com. I wrote a book on Titanic called 160 Minutes, The Race to Save the Titanic, that tells you really the story you haven't heard if you saw the movie Titanic. All my books, I'm going to tell you something you haven't heard. There's another book I wrote that's been very popular called Al Capone and the 1933 World's Fair, which is really a continuation of Devil in the White City. 40 years later, Chicago had another fair during the Great Depression, but they also had to get rid of Al Capone. One of my more popular books is Madam President: The Secret Presidency of Edith Wilson, who ran the country from 1919 to 1921. And again, I hope to unearth. I have a book called Wright Brothers Wrong Story, where I kind of break the mythology of the Wright brothers down that both of them created. It was really Wilbur Wright who created that plane, and Orville took the credit. So what I do is I try and get under history, tell you something that you haven't heard, and again, I started out as a novelist. I wrote 10 novels. So all my books are fiction, which is basically use the techniques of a novelist to bring to you history, but it's all footnoted, so it's true. But it's sort of what we see on Netflix now. That's all narrative nonfiction. So it's told in a way that'll keep you reading. And then I have another book called Hemingway's Attic, Hell and Glory in Cuba that'll be out next year, which is basically about Hemingway down in Cuba trying to write Old Man in the Sea when he was sort of in his heart of darkness phase of drinking and a lot of abuse and how he pulls off the Old Man in the Sea. So again, I'm trying to always bring something forward in all these. And I have two Teddy Roosevelt books, Last Charge of the Rough Riders, where I cover his last years where he wanted to charge the Germans with resurrected Rough Riders. And then, of course, Fortune a President, How the Wild West Created Teddy Roosevelt, which basically tells his years when he went west to the Badlands after his wife and mother died on the same day and came back the barrel-chested Teddy Roosevelt we know.
Hmm.
There's a few.
It sounds like you're pretty busy as a writer, and the genre you pick is certainly interesting too. It sounds like you really love history. Is that something that's always been an interest of yours? Is history something that you always like diving into?
Yeah, I have a master's in history. And I think what I found was narrative nonfiction was Madam President. And that began just when I read Wilson's biography, where he said, well, she was almost the president. And I thought, well, what's he mean by that? And then I found out that Woodrow Wilson, who only had 3 years of schooling, took over and ran the White House for the remaining 2 years from 1919 to 1921. Really our first woman president. We made all this noise about, Kamala Harris didn't. So anyway, yeah, I use that sort of, I'm very interested in the corners of history, things that happened, maybe haven't been that covered. And so because I was a natural story, and try and produce something that, hopefully people get interested in and buy.
Excellent. And if anybody wants to get in touch with you, of course, there's your webpage, williamhazelgrove.com. You have Facebook. You also have Twitter. So there's a lot of
Yeah.
ways to get in touch with you. I really appreciate, William, the chance to chat. This has been an interesting journey. I want to say thank you very much again for dropping in here and speaking with us. I think learning a bit about the War of the Worlds and what it really did has been an excellent journey. Thank you very much for sharing the story.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Excellent. Well, that's going to do it for this
Appreciate it.
edition. Yeah. Well, that is going to do it for this edition of Candid Conversations Zoomed In. I'm going to get this video up. And again, William, thank you very much for your time today. Hope you have a great rest of your day. And thank you again, folks, for tuning into our channel. Take care and have a terrific day.